For thousands of years, ships have passed within sight of a small green island in the Bay of Bengal. Sailors have seen smoke rising through the trees. Pilots have photographed narrow beaches where figures emerge carrying bows longer than themselves. Every attempt to cross that final stretch of water has ended the same way, with warning arrows, raised spears, and an unmistakable message: turn back. At first glance, this seems like the story of the world's most isolated tribe. But the greatest mystery surrounding the Sentinelese is not hidden beneath their forests. It is hidden inside a history no scientist has ever directly examined. Remarkably, one of the most important chapters in human evolution has been reconstructed without collecting a single DNA sample from the people themselves. Instead, archaeologists, geneticists, and anthropologists have pieced together fragments from neighboring islands, ancient migrations, changing coastlines, and the silent testimony of thousands of years of isolation. The result is a discovery that changes not only how we see the Sentinelese, but how we understand our own journey across the planet. The mystery begins long before anyone recorded the existence of North Sentinel Island. More than 60,000 years ago, small groups of modern humans began leaving Africa. For generations, researchers imagined these pioneers slowly moving inland through the Middle East before spreading into Europe and Asia. It was a logical story, one built from archaeology and geography. Then new evidence began challenging that picture. Instead of moving deep into continents, some researchers proposed that the earliest travelers hugged the coastlines. Following beaches, rivers, mangroves, and estuaries, they moved eastward over countless generations, living from the sea as much as the land. It became known as the Southern Coastal Dispersal. For years, it remained only a hypothesis. Then genetics entered the investigation. Ancient DNA studies from indigenous Andaman populations revealed something extraordinary. Their ancestry diverged from other Asian populations incredibly early, preserving genetic signatures connected to some of the first modern humans to leave Africa. Later migrations that transformed mainland Asia left surprisingly little trace within these island communities. The discovery forced scientists to reconsider an ancient journey that had almost disappeared beneath tens of thousands of years of history. Suddenly, the Andaman Islands were no longer a remote archipelago. They had become a living archive. Among those islands lies North Sentinel. Unlike neighboring communities, the Sentinelese have refused sustained contact with the outside world for as long as historical records exist. Because they remain completely protected from scientific sampling, researchers cannot sequence their DNA directly, yet their closest relatives provide an extraordinary clue. If neighboring Andaman peoples preserve one of humanity's deepest surviving genetic lineages, despite centuries of outside influence, what might remain among a population that has rejected almost every outsider for thousands of years? Ironically, the greatest genetic mystery on Earth is one scientists have deliberately chosen not to solve. That decision tells us as much about modern ethics as it does about ancient history. Before understanding why, it helps to understand the island itself. North Sentinel covers only about 60 square kilometers. Dense rainforest stretches almost uninterrupted from its center to brilliant white beaches. Coral reefs surround much of the coastline, creating a natural barrier that has wrecked ships and discouraged visitors for centuries. Isolation here is not accidental. Nature built defenses long before the Sentinelese ever lifted a bow. From above, the island appears peaceful, yet its inhabitants remain constantly alert to approaching boats. This vigilance is often portrayed as hostility. History suggests something different. One of the earliest documented sightings came in the 18th century, when passing sailors noticed fires burning inland. The people remained distant, observing strangers without inviting them ashore. As maritime traffic increased during the 19th century, encounters became more dangerous. Shipwrecked sailors occasionally reached the beaches, only to be attacked before rescue parties could recover them. To outsiders, these attacks seemed inexplicable. To the islanders, they may have represented survival. The most devastating encounter arrived in 1880. British colonial officer Maurice Portman landed with an armed expedition and captured several Sentinelese, including elderly adults and children. Removed from the island, the adults quickly died after exposure to diseases against which they possessed no immunity. The surviving children were eventually returned. No written record tells us what those children witnessed, but one does not need imagination to understand how such an event could echo through generations. Across the wider Andaman Islands, colonial expansion proved catastrophic. Introduced diseases, violence, displacement, and cultural disruption devastated several indigenous communities whose populations collapsed within decades. From the Sentinelese perspective, History offered overwhelming evidence that strangers brought only danger. Their arrows were not expressions of irrational aggression. They were a remarkably effective public health policy. This changes how we interpret nearly every later encounter. When an Indian cargo vessel ran aground on the reef in the 1980s, the crew initially believed rescue would come before local inhabitants reached them. Instead, they watched armed islanders gathering on the shore. Rescuers evacuated the stranded sailors just in time. Again, outsiders described hostility. Again, another interpretation exists. The Sentinelese had simply defended their territory. Even government expeditions attempting friendly contact often produced inconsistent results. At times, gifts such as coconuts were accepted. During other visits, arrows immediately followed. Some observers interpreted these shifting reactions as unpredictability. Anthropologists increasingly viewed them as caution. Every landing represented uncertainty. Every unfamiliar face carried unknown consequences. Then, in 2018, the entire world watched this pattern repeat itself. American missionary John Allen Chau believed he had a divine mission to bring Christianity to North Sentinel Island. He ignored legal restrictions designed to protect both himself and the Sentinelese. Local fishermen secretly transported him close to shore, despite knowing the risks. His first approach ended with arrows. One struck the Bible he carried. Most people would have recognized the message. Chau returned. After several attempts, he disappeared. Witnesses later reported seeing his body dragged along the beach. International headlines often framed the event as a tragedy. It certainly was, but perhaps not in the way many imagine. The Sentinelese had responded exactly as they had for centuries. The unusual decision belonged not to them, but to the outsider who repeatedly crossed a clearly defended boundary. Their behavior was entirely consistent. Ours was not. Yet while these dramatic encounters captured public attention, another investigation was unfolding quietly inside genetics laboratories. Researchers studying ancient DNA noticed an important pattern. Human history is rarely a simple story of one population replacing another. Instead, migrations overlap. Communities meet, intermarry, compete, exchange ideas, and gradually blend together. Modern populations often carry ancestry from numerous migrations separated by thousands of years. Europe experienced repeated waves of hunter-gatherers, early farmers, and steppe pastoralists. South Asia reflects multiple ancient population movements. East Asia tells its own complex story of expansion and admixture. Genetic mixing is almost the rule of human history. The Andaman Islanders stand apart because so much of that later mixing never occurred. Their ancestors appear to have separated from other human populations extraordinarily early, before remaining geographically isolated for immense spans of time. This does not make them living fossils, nor does it mean they stopped evolving. Evolution never stops. Instead, it means their history followed a different path. While continents experienced repeated migrations, their islands remain largely outside those demographic revolutions. That distinction matters enormously. Older colonial thinking often described isolated peoples as relics of humanity's primitive past. Modern anthropology rejects this entirely. The Sentinelese are not ancient humans frozen in time. They are thoroughly modern people whose ancestors adapted continuously to one environment for thousands of years. Even their technology demonstrates flexibility rather than stagnation. Visitors once assumed they existed in a permanent Stone Age because they did not smelt iron. Then researchers noticed iron-tipped arrows. The metal had not emerged from furnaces, it came from shipwrecks. Instead of inventing metallurgy independently, the Sentinelese recycled useful materials carried accidentally to their shores by the sea. This is not technological ignorance, it is practical innovation. When useful resources appeared, they incorporated them. When dangerous outsiders arrived with those resources, they rejected the outsiders while keeping the metal. Few survival strategies could be more rational. Every piece of evidence reveals thoughtful adaptation rather than timeless isolation. Archaeology tells a similar story. Sea levels at the end of the last ice age transformed coastlines across southern Asia. Lands that once connected islands disappeared beneath rising oceans. Communities became separated from one another. Over thousands of years, language, culture, and genetics gradually diverged. North Sentinel became one branch of a much older human story. Their isolation was not created overnight. It accumulated generation after generation until outside contact became almost unimaginable. Ironically, this long separation created an extraordinary scientific dilemma. Normally, when researchers discover a population capable of answering major questions about human evolution, they seek more data, more excavation, more DNA, more fieldwork. With the Sentinelese, those instincts collide with ethics. Everything known about the island indicates that outside contact risks introducing diseases capable of devastating the community. History provides repeated warnings. Neighboring indigenous populations suffered catastrophic mortality after sustained interaction with colonial societies. The Sentinelese have communicated the same message for centuries: leave us alone. Modern India has increasingly embraced that request. North Sentinel Island is protected by law. An exclusion zone prevents ordinary visitors from approaching its shores. Government monitoring generally occurs only from a distance, minimizing interference while helping deter illegal entry. Some critics argue that science loses valuable opportunities. Perhaps it does, but another perspective has gradually emerged. The unanswered questions themselves have become part of the lesson. Scientists can infer remarkable details about early human migration without violating the autonomy of the people they study. Archaeology provides clues. Genetics from related populations fills important gaps. Environmental history explains changing landscapes. Each discipline contributes evidence without demanding intrusion. Sometimes the most responsible investigation is the one that stops short of obtaining every possible answer. And that leads to the deepest revelation of all. The Sentinelese possess immense scientific importance precisely because they have remained beyond the reach of science. Their likely ancestry preserves one of humanity's oldest surviving branches outside Africa. Their history illuminates ancient migrations that carried modern humans across the southern edge of Asia. Their continued independence demonstrates that isolation itself can preserve chapters of our shared past that would otherwise disappear beneath later waves of migration and mixing. Yet none of those discoveries grants anyone the right to step ashore. In fact, they argue the opposite. The more valuable their history becomes, the greater our responsibility to protect the people who carry it. For centuries, outsiders believed the greatest mystery of North Sentinel Island waited somewhere inside its forests. Today we know better. The real mystery stretches backward through tens of thousands of years, connecting one small island to the earliest footsteps our species took beyond Africa. And perhaps the most remarkable achievement is not that science uncovered part of that story. It is that, for once, science recognized there are some doors that should remain closed. The Sentinelese have never written a history of themselves. Instead, they have defended it with silence. Sometimes silence preserves the oldest stories of all.